Ready to go!
You're listening to By Land and by Sea, powered by the Maritime Professor. Last week we covered this topic. The Coast Guard is still out there doing the work. They're still standing the watch. They're still supporting maritime safety and security, and they're still serving this country. And yet, during this partial government shutdown, the U.S. Coast Guard has been caught in the middle of a funding mess that never should have happened, right? Last week when I was working through the issue for the podcast, I was writing my script and writing my thoughts down. I kept running into the same problem. I wanted to make sure that I was getting it right, and not just mostly right, not just close enough, but right. Because this isn't a casual topic. We are talking about real missions, real families, real consequences, and real problems. The service just simply doesn't stop because Washington can't get its act together. So I did what I do when I need help pressure testing what I'm seeing. I ended up picking up the phone and called someone I trust. And so that's what today's episode is. It's a little glimpse into my Rolodex, I guess, who I have when I have questions, particularly on Coast Guard, who I call when I want to make sure that I'm not missing something, that I'm not really getting it wrong. And in this case, who I called because the Coast Guard funding crisis deserves more than just surface level commentary. It deserves accuracy. Hi, welcome back to By Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor, former FMC International Affairs attorney, and founder of Squall Strategies. By Land and by Sea is your go-to resource for navigating the regulatory side of global ocean shipping. And me, I'm your favorite maritime attorney, aren't I? As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. There is no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So let's get into it because, as you know, ocean shipping moves the world. All right. Now, today's conversation is a little different. And honestly, I think it's a good thing. It's a quick conversation. Last week, when I was speaking about the tragedy of the Coast Guard not being funded during this partial government shutdown, and the reminder that Coast Guard is part of Department of Homeland Security, I was having trouble sourcing information that felt current or solid enough for me to be comfortable with kind of every single part of the way that I wanted to talk about it. And I wanted to get it right because I wanted to actually find out who was getting paid, who wasn't getting paid, who kind of got paid and then now isn't getting paid. This is one of those things that I really wanted to make sure that I got right. And it's not just about the budget fight. It's about the people still doing the work, right? The uncertainty is hanging over their pay, over their families, over their decisions, their operations, and the basic support systems around them. So, as I said in the hook, I did what I do when I need help getting something right. I called someone I trust, and that person for me was retired Coast Guard Rear Admiral John Mauger. And I thought, instead of keeping that conversation behind the scenes, why not bring it directly to all of you listening to By Land and by Sea? I had the conversation while I was driving my daughter to swim. But what I wanted to do, and what you'll hear just shortly, is have that almost the same conversation of, well, what the heck is happening? What is going on? Who has gotten paid? Who hasn't gotten paid? Civilian versus officer and enlisted. What are all of the things that are happening? Because I wanted the credibility, the context, the perspective, but the accuracy, right? This is serious. The Coast Guard is being forced to continue its mission while funding remains mostly in limbo for what's going to happen next. Rear Admiral John Mauger, U.S. Coast Guard retired, brings more than 30 years of leadership experience across national security, intermodal supply chains, and cybersecurity. He served as commander of the 1st Coast Guard District, where he led 12,000 personnel and oversaw critical port operations from Maine to New Jersey. He also served in senior flag roles tied to U.S. maritime safety, security, and environmental regulatory programs. And earlier in his career, he sailed as a shipboard engineer and worked on domestic and international shipping regulatory issues. In other words, he's exactly the kind of person I wanted to call when I wanted to pressure test and just accuracy check what I was seeing. Also, I want to zoom out for a minute here because this conversation is happening at the same time that this week Congress is actually having a much bigger conversation about revitalizing shipbuilding in the maritime industrial base. This week, you might have caught it, there was a joint hearing between the Armed Services and Transportation and Infrastructure subcommittees. One of the themes that came through over and over was that none of this works without a system, right? Not just one ship here, one yard there, one workforce initiative over there. It's a system. It has to be a system. and that includes cargo, fleet, shipbuilding, workforce, demand signal, long-term planning. Those were the ideas that were running through that hearing. I encourage you to go take a listen. Even though it says it's over 3 hours, there are some breaks when they had to go for votes. So it's not actually 3 hours that you have to dedicate to listening to it, probably more like an hour, hour and a half. I think you should go listen to it. It was really interesting. But look, what I wanted to cover again today was the Coast Guard funding issue. It's not happening in a vacuum, right? It sits inside this broader maritime moment where lawmakers are trying to rebuild American shipbuilding, strengthen the industrial base, and figure out how to support the overall maritime workforce for the long haul. The hearing also underscored some of the tensions in that effort. Everyone wants speed, but the witnesses kept coming back to the same point that design maturity, stable demand, workforce retention, coordinated long-term investment all matter if you actually want to get the ships delivered on time and on budget and for the long term. Coast Guard was also pressed during that hearing about planning documents, which I can appreciate the question, right? Planning and future planning is part of all of this. That is what we are doing with these large ideas that we are tackling. And these planning reports have been late. And maybe, and well, it's true. They've been later than just this partial shutdown. But look, it also felt like maybe it was ill-timed because where funding itself is still uncertain for the Coast Guard specifically, it's not exactly surprising the long-range planning documents may not be sitting at the top of what gets treated as essential work. However, I want to be fair, some of those long-range planning documents were beyond just this small partial shutdown, and I say small in time, not in significance. The hearing reflected both sides of that tension. Congress wants overdue reporting and clear planning, at least in this one little questioning segment, while the Coast Guard is operating in a moment where the immediate mission and immediate uncertainty are understandably taking up the oxygen. They are mission essential. There was some funding, and we'll talk about this when I talk to Rear Admiral Mauger in a minute, that you'll be listening to. But while today's conversation is specifically about the Coast Guard and the funding instability here, it also fits into this much larger conversation happening right now in the Hill about American maritime capacity, what readiness actually requires, and what happens when we underinvest for too long and then try to sprint our way out of it. And one quick housekeeping note before I drop in the interview here. In the recorded conversation that you're about to hear, it happened yesterday, Thursday, April 23rd. We pre-recorded it. I accidentally said that the Ships for America Act was reintroduced this week on Wednesday. That was actually incorrect. The bill was reintroduced on April 30th, 2025, so last year. What happened this week was a renewed push on the Hill. I thought that maybe they reintroduced it with the new year. Looks like, and still kind of determining, but it looks like it was a renewed push on the Hill to move it forward. A coalition of labor and industry groups publicly urging Congress to pass it. You know, sometimes I bring in conversations that may not entirely be fully polished. Maritime Action Plan, instant reaction, I think is a perfect example of that. But I actually think that natural conversational discussion is part of what gives these episodes, hopefully, authenticity. So while last week I may have miscategorized a few things, if you listen back to it and said, you know, she said that they're not doing NMC, National Maritime Center application processing, I've since learned that actually did restart, I think last Wednesday or last Thursday, but on Friday when I did the recording, I said that it hadn't. So little things like that. Look, I was just, even with it being not entirely polished or perhaps not even fully developed, even in my mind yet, I had to bring the conversation to you. I had to bring attention to it. I wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page here, that we are still in a partial government shutdown for the Coast Guard. Because look, the topic itself, no matter how imperfectly or perfectly I'm able to present it in the moment, I still think the things that I bring you are worthy of conversation and attention. Obviously, that's why I'm bringing them to you. But also some of my questions, or maybe even the things that I'm getting wrong, because I stay pretty closely connected. I'm watching a lot of what's going on, whether it's the actual hearing, the trade press coverage of it, whatever it is. I'm staying very close to it. So what I kind of approach it with is if I'm missing it, then you know, certainly I'm not the only one watching this, but maybe there's room for accuracy. And so that's what I wanted to do this week. Like I said, get more information, get more accuracy, refine some of the fumbles that I had and how I categorized or talked about some of these things in real time, because funding situation itself has been fluid. This issue is too important for me to just sit on and fiddle over precision. Look, everything wasn't entirely buttoned up. It still isn't entirely buttoned up. But look, I wanted to bring you the conversation with retired Rear Admiral John Mauger, so please enjoy. Well, thank you, Admiral Mauger, for joining me today. This is so wonderful to have you joining us on By Land and by Sea. Thank you for taking some time out of, I understand you're in Nashville, which is incredible.
Music City. I hope your listeners can't hear the music going on in the background, but wow, it's a really a nice city. I've enjoyed my time down here. It's sunny and it's warm. I look forward to getting back to New England, but for right now, I'm enjoying the time that I have.
Well, bring that sunny weather back with you. Before we kick off, though, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to my listeners so they know a little bit about who you are.
Sure, Lauren. And hey, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a longtime fan and a big listener, but first-time caller in this particular podcast. So thanks so much for the opportunity. So I'm Rear Admiral John Mauger. I had a 37-year career in the Coast Guard, spanning a whole bunch of interesting and wonderful things. Your Coast Guard does so many things for the nation. We have brave men and women who jump out of helicopters and put their lives at risk to save folks in the water. We have law enforcement officers that jump on board drug subs transiting in the Pacific region that are keeping people safe and saving lives here in the U.S. through interdiction of illegal narcotics. I did none of that. I was a federal maritime regulator, the lead federal maritime regulator that ensured the safety, security, and in some cases the sustainability of shipping in the U.S. I retired in 24 after spending 37 years with the service and opened a consulting company to help folks within the industry and within government understand and manage kind of all the different changes that are coming at them. As you note so many times in your podcast, there's a lot of changes that are continuously happening in the maritime industry, a lot of recalculation that needs to get done. And so I'm working to help make that a little bit simpler for folks where I can.
Well, and I appreciate what you do. You helped me translate quite a few of the very scientific, data-based type things through the years. So I really appreciate your friendship and your partnership and your help with all of those questions. And I want to be fair. You minimized your experience with the Coast Guard. You were incredible and one of the lead people for the Titan submersible. So certainly, if anybody's watching this on video, you may recognize Admiral Mauger from his TV appearances when Titan submersible unfortunately happened.
Yeah, that was unfortunate. I hope folks will remember just the amazing work that the crews and the partners all involved in that case did. It was not the outcome that we had all hoped for or worked so hard for, but it was just monumental to sit back and reflect on how that came about and how many people responded, how quickly they responded, how selflessly they gave. And hopefully we get another chance at some point, Lauren, to get back and share some of the stories with your listeners, because while it's not at the heart of supply chain, it is at the heart of a lot of maritime issues. And so would love to tell that story at some point.
I would love that. Actually, I was just thinking as it came up, I had you speak in front of one of my classes at Mass Maritime that I teach in the grad program, and the stories that you have are incredible. But to the point, what we're talking about today and why you are a fantastic person to talk about it is last week I kind of got on a little bit of a soapbox, but I think appropriately so, talking about federal funding, right? There's some parts of the federal government that people notice immediately when funding runs into trouble. And there's other parts that people don't know until real consequences start happening. And unfortunately, we're in kind of this strange, dysfunctional piece of time where Coast Guard is still not funded and nobody's really talking about it. So I wanted to talk to you about it on this show.
Sure.
What is going on? Things are moving very quickly. Last week, I think incorrectly said they weren't doing any of the NMC, the Coast Guard must earn or license. They are now, last week, I believe, starting to process that back again. But give me a little snapshot of what exactly is going on and is there hope here?
Sure. This has been a really difficult situation for all of those members that serve across the Department of Homeland Security. I think many of your listeners will realize that the Coast Guard is a member of the Department of Homeland Security. We're a military service at all times. And the Commandant of the Coast Guard sits on the Joint Staff. But all of our funding comes through the Department of Homeland Security. And so when funding to the Department of Homeland Security is cut, it impacts the Coast Guard. And so just this fiscal year alone, so since October 1st of 2025, we're not quite even 6 months into the fiscal year, or 180 days into the fiscal year. But we've already had over 110 days where DHS employees have not been funded on time for their work. Now, there are provisions that, once these shutdowns end and once, either temporary funding or annual funding gets provided, appropriated, that the employees will get back pay. But we've asked employees to work for 45 days on end, now over 70 days on end, without, actually paying them on time, without giving them any clarity as to when their next paychecks are coming. And that's having real consequences for our homeland security and in some cases for our national security as well. And so it's been a really difficult position. I appreciate you providing some perspectives on that last year and bringing this attention back to the forefront. As you noted, impacts to the mariners that serve our nation and their ability to get licenses and credentials updated on time, and in cases, impacts to other events across the service as well. And I think what's really difficult about this is that the men and women in the Coast Guard that I know that I've served with, they all want to serve. They don't ask a lot. They just want to be, paid for their work and given the opportunity to do the missions that they signed up for. And so this is really, a difficult time for everybody to kind of see how our government handles these situations.
Well, and I think that that's important to note, right? The way that society understood that TSA agents were still showing up to work but not getting paid, that is the same with Coast Guard right now, is that we are still doing drug interdictions, we are still doing homeland security by water, all of the things that Coast Guard does, safety, security, search and rescue, all of the incredible things that Coast Guard is tasked with are still happening, but they're certainly happening. I mean, we've been in this partial government shutdown for 2 months, it feels, more than 2 months perhaps. That's a long time for people to go without pay and yet still showing up to work. And so that's got to be tolling and taxing on their kind of overall morale. And there was also last week, I believe we were chatting before, last week there was a return to work. And so actually, can you speak a little bit about, there's kind of two different, there's military Coast Guard, but then there's or officer, or but then there's also civilian. And so,
Sure.
can you speak a little bit about, are both of those categories being captured by this? Is everybody being required to return to work? Is nobody kind of getting paid? There was that promise for the back pay, like you said,
Sure.
but still rent is due every month. Mortgages are due
Sure.
every month. And so that's why it was so alarming to me last week to kind of have this realization of like, everybody is still not getting paid here.
Sure. There's a couple different issues at play here, and so let me. Hopefully, I can make them clear to your listeners, because it's a complicated issue across the board. And every shutdown, these are inherently political decisions made by our congressional leaders, and so and in some cases the executive branch, and so they all have kind of their own twists and turns to them in each case. So let me hopefully clarify some of this. First of all, just like you said, the core missions of the service, what the government calls essential functions, are still being performed. But that doesn't mean that we should all be satisfied that lives are getting saved and drugs are being interdicted and those things, because some of the planning functions, the acquisition of supplies and new capabilities has stopped. Some of the planning functions have stopped. The travel and outreach to members that they serve have stopped. And so all of those things are generally not considered as core essential functions and are generally, stopped or slowed just to preserve kind of, those basic response type missions. Let me try and also provide a little bit of clarity of kind of the timing of this and who was impacted. As you noted, the Coast Guard's divided into uniformed service members. Those are our active duty officer and enlisted members. You see them in the small boat stations, you see them in the aircraft and the helicopters, and these folks do wonderful things. But we also have a very large civilian workforce, and these folks do wonderful things as well. Unfortunately, when it comes to shutdowns, they're not treated the same. Military members are required to work irrespective of whether they get paid or not. In the early days of the shutdown, they were afforded, I think, about 2 weeks or 2 pay periods worth of pay, or about a month's worth of pay. And then there was a one-time makeup at the beginning of April where Secretary Mullen, the new Secretary of DHS, used, under direction of President Trump, used some funds to pay troops again. Our civilian members, in some cases, some of them are required to work without pay. In other cases, some of them are furloughed and not allowed to work, and often not allowed to seek other employment while they're furloughed. And in this case, they were recalled at the beginning of April. They were also afforded some back pay under Secretary Mullen's execution of the president's executive order. And so as of April 1st, members had been paid for the time that they had served between February and April 1st. But now going forward, Secretary Mullen indicated earlier this week in his testimony to Congress that he doesn't have enough money to keep paying the employees of DHS during the shutdown. He said payroll is about $1.6 billion every 2 weeks for all the employees at DHS, and there's just not that much money available. And so the way forward is very unclear, because right now everybody's been directed to come back to work, and folks have done that. These are good American citizens that want to get back to doing their mission, to the reason they joined or served in the Coast Guard. But it's not clear when we're going to get them their next paychecks.
And that's really important. I'm glad that you clarified that. So they were paid through to April 1st for that kind of shutdown period in February through April 1st. And I'm so glad that you clarified this, because as I was prepping for last week for my episode on this, it was unclear. It just even kind of general press coverage where Coast Guard kind of fell in that, and was it in line with some of the other things? Everything is so politicized in this world that unfortunately the Coast Guard it feels like they're getting forgotten in the larger conversation. There's this whole politics side of DHS. Feel how you want, but Coast Guard is such an important, pivotal, crucial role in the nation's security that it just can't keep getting caught in these political discussions. And, unfortunately, it is. And it's unfortunately not captured under DOD directly. It is under Department of Homeland Security. And I only say unfortunately because imagine if you were to go a few months without the Navy getting paid or the Army getting paid. That's the equivalency in my mind of kind of how severe this is. And so I'm happy to hear that it was members were paid up until April 1st. But again, going forward, without having the money to pay for all of DHS, which includes Coast Guard, as we know, it's just such it's such a tragedy. It's like I can't even quite capture the word of this is horrible.
Yeah, and I think look, I appreciate that members were paid, and I know that they appreciate that as well. But there's a whole lot of uncertainty that came with that. If you figure for the last 6 months, you've spent almost 4 months working without a constant paycheck. That's not a comfortable position to be in. We don't know, these men and women are professionals across DHS, but we don't really understand how that impacts their decision making, how that impacts their focus on work. And what I would tell you too is that the way ahead for this is really complex and unclear as well. I think you'll tell your listeners we're getting a chance to talk here on Thursday. I think it's April 23rd. Stay tuned because it's really a developing story right now. Just this morning, the Senate voted to put together a reconciliation bill that would fund portions of DHS, specifically ICE and Customs Border Protection, through the end of the Trump administration. So provide 3 years of funding just for ICE and CBP. They did that because the House Republicans have held up the appropriation of DHS funding and action on a Senate passed bill because they want assurances that there won't be another shutdown fight over ICE and CBP during President Trump's term. And so it's not clear that that bill, the Senate's action on that bill and the House action on that bill, it's probably going to be a couple of weeks, if not a month, until that gets finalized. And so it's not clear if the House is going to take up the Senate's passed bill to provide funding for the rest of DHS just for the rest of the year, which, by the way, is only until the end of September 30th this year. So at this point, it's about 5 or 6 months worth of funding. It's not clear when the House is going to take that up. So we don't know how long this is going to last. But we know that Congress is taking actions on it, as we speak, as we're talking about this afternoon. And so stay tuned.
But even so, and I appreciate that you said today is Thursday, April 23rd, that we are recording this in the afternoon. So we'll see by the time this runs tomorrow. But I appreciate that you mentioned that what's happening is some carve-outs for ICE and CBP. But what isn't mentioned there then, right, the obvious, well, okay, so that's moving forward, but Coast Guard is still kind of left in this lurch of, waiting for the politics to get sorted out before Coast Guard is then brought back into the fund the rest of DHS. It's almost too bad that it gets categorized in this, the rest of DHS, because it is, I can't say it enough. You obviously know it. Such a critical role. We probably have Coast Guard members right now that are over in the Middle East that are helping with port security and some of the things that are happening there that are also not assured pay going forward. We actually have members of Coast Guard that are out there doing very critical, dangerous, important work, part of all of the geopolitics of everything that's happening out there, and yet they're the ones that are standing right alongside men and women who are getting paid and probably actually getting tax benefits and all sorts of stuff.
Right. Well, we do have Coast Guard men and women serving all over the world, all across the world today, and on the front lines of national security missions, no matter where they're working. And yes, at this point, they're doing it out without the assurance of pay. Earlier you had mentioned that it's implausible to imagine that Navy sailors wouldn't be paid, if there was a shutdown to DoD. Well, Congress found that implausible too, and so they passed a law several years ago that required military members in the Department of Defense to be paid even when there is a government shutdown. The Coast Guard, there's been a number of congressmen that have put forward the same provisions for Coast Guard members, but in each case that hasn't been approved or authorized, and so the Coast Guard members remain in a difficult position. I can tell you that they are true professionals and that they are working hard, but it's really the erosion of trust in the government. It's the erosion, the impact that it has on families, and spouses who are like, hey, enough is enough. We can find something else to do. That creates a problem. I'd also like to note, though, that there are a number of different organizations that have come forward to help. The Coast Guard has its own mutual assistance program called Coast Guard Mutual Assistance. They've been amazing at providing support for our members throughout. There's also, Navy Federal Credit Union, USAA, the big military banks and institutions. have also been instrumental in providing either zero interest loans or deferred payments or those types of things to kind of help folks manage it. But this is no way to run a federal government agency, especially when we consider that the maritime transportation system provides, $5.4 trillion of economic benefit to the country. That's 25% of U.S. GDP. The Coast Guard is really the one that's sitting there ensuring the safety, security of that maritime transportation system. And so this is a really important issue for your listeners to take note of. And I appreciate you bringing this to everybody's attention.
Well, I appreciate your time and I appreciate you digging into this because, like I said, it was difficult to find true hard information on this out there just in the media and the press, whether it was industry specific for maritime or whether it was just out there generally for Coast Guard. So, that I wanted to make sure that we got kind of the real story of what actually is going on. I also think that hopefully, this week was Navy League doing their Sea Air Space Expo. There was also a sail-in on the Hill where the ships for America actually got reintroduced. So certainly this week there was conversations around maritime and military maritime. I would hope that Coast Guard was part of those conversations. I know they were at Sea Air Space. I'm hopeful that maybe there was a little bit of movement or at least education or awareness that this is still going on, that while we have a lot of plans for maritime generally as a nation, that it has to start with some great support for our military members in the Coast Guard that are out there doing this. And I thank you for your service, and thank you to the entire Coast Guard for all of the members and all of their service during this uncertain time. So thank you so much for joining me today. It sounds like you might be getting started back with your conference.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Lauren. Again, big fan of what you're doing and helping to folks to understand how important this industry is and demystify different portions of it because it affects all of our lives. And so thanks for telling those stories.
Well, thank you so much. Great to see you, and we'll have you back for sure. Thanks so much.
Take care.
That was retired Rear Admiral John Mauger, and I really appreciated the chance to have that conversation. This is the part that I don't want people to miss. The Coast Guard is not optional, and I don't think that we should start reading into this as a purposeful non-funding of the Coast Guard. I think that this is an accidental overstep. It's getting caught in a larger political conversation. It's not sub-side agency that just quietly absorbed political dysfunction without consequence. It's a massive mission-driven operational service that people depend on every single day, whether they realize it or not. And when funding instability drags on, the consequences don't stay neatly contained inside Washington. It's Coast Guard families, it's morale, it's operations, it's credentialing and backlogs for an industry that we're saying is national security. Maritime security is national security. It's ripping across the broader maritime system. We have to take care of this now. The broader maritime system point is exactly why I think the conversation connects the hearing that we just saw on shipbuilding in the maritime industrial base this week to this larger conversation. One of the clearest messages from that hearing, as I said, was the maritime strength is not built by one-off gestures. It takes predictable demand, workforce investment, shipyard capacity, smarter acquisition, and actual coordination across the system, a dedicated path that we are moving on. There's a lot of discussion about distributed shipbuilding, cargo preference, workforce shortages, design build before discipline, and the fact that the long-term commitment matters more than just the burst of attention. And I think that that's the most important part. We are rebuilding an entire movement with this maritime dominance return. This doesn't just apply to Navy ships or commercial maritime policy. It applies to everything, Coast Guard included. If you want readiness, if you want resilience, if you want a maritime nation that can actually perform like one, then you can't keep treating the Coast Guard like an afterthought. That's about as strong as I'm going to go. Yes, this was a government funding story. It continues to be. I will continue to monitor this. I'll bring you updates as I get them. But I really needed to bring this back to you because I wanted to get a little bit more accuracy on what's happening here. This is important. If you like this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review. Want to go deeper on these topics or bring this kind of insight to your team? Visit themaritimeprofessor.com to explore corporate trainings, tailored briefings, and on-demand webinars, all designed to make complex maritime regulations practical and easy to understand. And if your organization needs help navigating the legal or strategic side of ocean shipping, head over to Squall Strategies. That's where I provide the consulting services, regulatory guidance, and policy support for clients working in this space. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and not legal advice. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. Until next time, I'm Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.